Welcome back to Raisina at Canberra, the Australia session, the remotely conducted from Australia session of the vitally important Raisina dialogue, such a key regional dialogue in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. I'm Rory Medcalf. I'm the head of the National Security College at the Australian National University, and I'm really pleased to introduce our next session looking at technology partnership in the Indo-Pacific, the heart of global growth in technology. And this session is going to bring together voices, both expert and practitioner voices and industry voices from India, from Bangladesh, from Australia and the United States. I'm particularly pleased to note that we have Minister of State for Information and Communication Technology, Zunaid Ahmed Palak from Bangladesh, and also Australia's Ambassador for Cyber Security and Critical Technology, Ambassador Tobias Feakin. And their involvement in this with colleagues from the United States and India reminds us that the great game, if you like, or the great contest, and the great challenge of cooperation in critical and emerging technologies is not simply a US-China story, it's very much a regional narrative here in the Indo-Pacific. So many of the centres of innovation and opportunity and growth are located not only in the United States and China, but in middle players, middle powers, emerging smart powers. Some work that my own team at the National Security College have conducted recently has underscored this fact. The Quad Tech Network, an arrangement we have supported by the Australian government to look at opportunities for technology cooperation, innovation and security among the Quad partners, Australia, the United States, India, Japan, has illuminated some of this potential. At the same time, so much of the opportunity is in other centres of power in the region, countries in Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, elsewhere, where you have young populations, entrepreneurial populations, and new investment opportunities. At the same time, there is a geopolitical and a strategic overlay to this challenge, because of course, strategic competition is no longer just a story about military power, but in many ways, the commanding heights of emerging and critical technologies are where the power map of the Indo-Pacific will be drawn. So I hope you find value in this session, and I look forward to engaging with you further on tech issues in the Indo-Pacific during the Raisina dialogue and beyond. Thank you.
Welcome to Raisina Dialogue 2021. We are living in times of a paradox of sorts. While all our collective knowledge, advances in science and cooperation between nations has not been able to become a deterrent that is good enough for the virus that has turned our lives upside down presently, and yet the technological advancements made by humans over the last couple of decades has ensured today that while all of us here on the panel are socially distanced, sitting in different continents, we can still continue to put our heads together to discuss the future in a region of critical emerging importance, the Indo-Pacific. The topic of discussion here today is the heart of growth technology partnerships in the Indo-Pacific, and I have with me an eminent panel here, and this should be a rather captivating discussion that will hold your attention, unlike what technology is accused of doing quite often, reducing our attention span. Joining me today on this discussion is Zunaid Ahmed Palak, Minister of State for Information and Communication Technology, Bangladesh; Tobias Feakin, Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Australia; Mohandas Pai, Chairman, Manipal, Global Education India. S for Kapoor, member, Policy Planning Staff, State Department, Professor, Department of National Security Affairs, U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, United States. Erin Watson-Lynn, International Relations Consultant and former Senior Fellow, Perth US Asia Centre in Australia. Well, the Indo-Pacific has emerged as a new theatre of regional activity and robust technological partnerships. At the same time, the heartland of global growth is also coping with enormous political and economic churn. Its future growth prospects will depend on its ability to create resilience and promote innovation and entrepreneurship. So let me begin with Zunaid Ahmed Palak. So what has the pandemic really taught us about partnerships, first of all? Are we any wiser, or does the pandemic have the capacity to churn out, in fact, the worst in us, from cyber attacks on vaccine manufacturing facilities to richer countries and pharma companies still not agreeing to share vaccine technology for greater public good?
Thank you very much, Maha, for actually giving me the opportunity to speak at this very important platform in this Raisina dialogue. And this is the first time we are 100% participating by using online platforms, and we are adapting with this new normal due to this COVID-19 situation from different countries, different areas. So I would like to give my heartiest thanks to the Ministry of External Affairs and the Observer Research Foundation for organizing these timely initiatives. And also today's topic is very important for all of us, because this coronavirus pandemic has been a difficult time for all of us. Our people and businesses have been hurt economically and socially. As physically movement, interaction, and the commerce slowed down, global supply chains have been in the spotlight since lockdown, disrupted factories, closed borders, and reduced the number of passenger flights able to carry freight. This is resulting a significant overhaul of the status quo. But in Bangladesh, since the very beginning of this pandemic, we are having partnership from the government side to the private sector. At the same time, we are having partnership with the entrepreneurs, startups, and all of our technological innovations and initiatives in our country. So we believe in partnership strategy, because it is inside the country, government, private sector, and the innovators, startups, and also academicians. But at the same time, we have to be serious about the over-reliance on single suppliers of goods critical to national security comes with a high risk. And also, you know that everything is going to on the digital platform, our meetings, communications, business, education, health. So we have to be careful about the cybersecurity. So in Bangladesh, I can share that we have set up the computer incident response team. We are communicating with our local fintech, health platforms, telemedicine. But at the same time, we need international cooperation, partnership, and also the information sharing mechanism, because we cannot save our digital platform alone. We have to work together. So I would like to request all of our Indo-Pacific member countries, nations, and partners to work together to make a secure digital space for all of us. So I think this is the right time to collaborate and cooperate together, and Raisina Dialogue platform can be a really good place to have more partnership and understanding between us.
Absolutely. Tobias, I want to come to you now. As India and Australia are in the process of taking forward their tech partnership in the Indo-Pacific, and Australia is also set to organize the Sydney Dialogue, are these partnerships and dialogues that are being fueled at the moment currently, are they to counter some particular forces in the Indo-Pacific? Are we looking at China particularly, or is it genuine cooperation in the region?
So I think let me build on the previous answer. Actually, what we've seen during the last 15 to 18 months is the fact that a recognition of quite how central digital technologies and those new and emerging technologies that build off of the infrastructure that cyberspace provides, whether it's quantum computing, AI, et cetera, you'll know the list well, everyone listening as well, is that those technologies are not only central to our development economically and our social development, but they're also being increasingly contested. So we've seen during the pandemic how supply chains have been impacted, and the realization that, you know, if we get stuck in a position of sole source manufacturing or purchasing, we then will stand to miss out, if you like, on the opportunities of those technologies. And we've also seen, you know, not the disruption of those technologies, but how central they've become to geopolitics. And I think, you know, even if I just give you that statement, there's so much that feeds off the back of that. So new and emerging and alternative partnerships are absolutely central. I and the Australian government have always been a big believer in, you know, working with think tanks, universities, industry, to try and find better policy and technical solutions to some of these issues. It's the only way we're going to work ourselves out of or if you like, understand the landscape and create better solutions is through that multi-dimensional partnerships arrangements. So the Sydney Dialogue being one of those, things like a Quad Tech Network, which the ORF is part of, in looking at how we work together, how you can influence, if you like, government discussions from outside are incredibly important. And then you rightfully say, you know, some of our new architecture we're putting in government to government, such as the Australian-India partnership on cyber and critical technologies is vital, because it's looking at how can we stimulate joint R&D in these areas? How can we ensure that we're working in partnership around the region to enhance others' abilities to take advantages of critical and emerging technologies as well? So I think, you know, what are the watchwords here? It's partnership, it's flexibility, and it's being able to mobilize those efforts quickly and efficiently in order that we can take advantages of the outstanding opportunities that do exist. So for me, in my heart, this is still a story of opportunity rather than, you know, so much of the risk that we know are out there, and we know they're a big problem, but this is still fundamentally an opportunity story and for the Indo-Pacific to drive forward.
All right. The question really is whether these opportunities are being driven because of a fear or an understanding that there is one player in the region that could become overarching. As Paul Kapoor, I want to bring you in here. Many believe that the obvious tech race that we are talking about in the Indo-Pacific is being driven by competition between the US and China. In that context, how will it benefit other countries in the region if the idea is so narrow in its origin, relying largely on private?
Well, thanks, Maha, and thanks to ORF for the invitation. I'll say that my comments here reflect only my own opinions, and I'm not with policy planning anymore. I was, but I'm now just wearing my academic hat. So speaking purely for myself, I think that the technological race, as you put it, between China and the US, it's not just garden variety economic competition. It's driven to a large extent by a recognition that you know, there is a problem with technology security, and that the equipment and software coming from China may compromise telecommunications and data networks, and that would make them vulnerable, frankly. And this, of course, is a concern, especially with regard to burgeoning 5G networks. So staying away from, you know, if you talk about that competition and you know, what the US would like to see, if we stay away from, let's say, Chinese 5G, that's not just going to benefit the United States by undermining an economic rival or even a strategic competitor, but it will benefit, I think, the region and regional states by protecting them from the possibility of compromise. right? And that will benefit the U.S., right, which doesn't want to see the Indo-Pacific data networks be insecure. But it's, again, not just a narrow U.S. interest. It's something that I think everybody would benefit from if the United States were successful here. And, you know, I think that's going to require the U.S. to do a number of things, among them exposing instances where there is corrupt Chinese behavior, such as coercion or illicit subsidies to customers, also helping to ensure that the costs of finding alternatives to Chinese technology are manageable for states in the region, and that they're able to deploy substitutes. And also embedding 5G and other tech cooperation in broader cybersecurity efforts between like-minded states. But again, I think if the U.S. is successful in this effort, the benefits are going to be widespread in the region, and it's not just going to be limited to the United States, even if there is an element of U.S.-China competition in this. So I'd say everyone's got a stake in this project.
All right. So I'll take that bit with Zunaid Ahmed later on, but I want to bring in Erin Watson over here. Erin, you know, under the present conditions of competitive rivalry, it appears costs are not the determining factor anymore for technology. There are other factors playing on countries' minds. For instance, increasing concerns with regards to implications of technology for governance, geopolitics, data protection, national security. Do you think ultimately this is what is going to determine the future game, if I can put it that way, in the Indo-Pacific?
Excellent question, and Maha, thank you so much for having me here, and to ORF as well. I think just to go back quickly on something that's already been talked about, is one of the great things about this dialogue is that it brings people together from so many different regions, and here in Australia we can be very focused on that China-US dynamic, where Raisina actually does bring in countries from the African continent, countries from the Latin American continent, so we can really broaden our view on all of these things that we're talking about. But with regards to those decisions from business, what I'm seeing is I do a lot of work, often on behalf of the Australian government, with Southeast Asia and young entrepreneurs and innovators across the region. And while for us sitting here as analysts and scholars and government representatives, we think about security, we think about geopolitics, those young people across the region are not thinking about that. They are making those decisions when it comes down to cost. They're thinking about ease of partnerships. They're not thinking, oh, I don't want to collaborate with China or other countries in the region. So I do think that this is where perhaps we see this disconnect between what's going on in the business community and what's going on in the security realm. And I think we see that, you know, Tobias might be able to answer that well for us as well. We see that in the business in the big business community in Australia. At the end of the day, we make money working with China, and that means that Australia has I guess, a risk in terms of its diversification, current commercial diversification, because we're not working enough with countries like Indonesia, with countries like India, other countries across Southeast Asia and so on. But I think that's at the end of the day, business doesn't look at the world through that security lens. Perhaps increasingly, I think technology will drive that more, but largely it has, and particularly for Australia, where education we've seen impacted by COVID-19, but at the end of the day, sending coal and iron ore from a ship from up in Port Hedland, you know, that's going to be a bottom line decision. It's not about tech transfer or anything like that. So I do think that there is that disconnect between the two areas, business and security.
All right. I think the best person to answer that would be Mohandas Pai. Does that disconnect exist? And is Erin right when she says that the business side will look at costs first, not perhaps so much go into the realm of geopolitics or security? Or has that changed over the last 1 year, especially during the pandemic?
Well, I think business always looks at making money, increasing revenues, increasing market valuation, etc. That is business for you. But business has become cognizant of the risk that is there in the digital revolution. Ma, please remember, after COVID, suddenly the world went digital. The great majority of people are connected together on the network. the COVID-19 pandemic showed the world how vulnerable everybody is. At the same time, how interdependent you are. The supply chains are interdependent on China. China shut down in February last year, and the world came to a standstill. 24% of global manufacturing is from China, right? So now I think business is looking at it in a very different lens and saying, how do we diversify? How do we make sure that we work together? What was scary for India was 62% of our digital territory was conquered by the Chinese apps. Luckily for us, you know, our government banned the Chinese apps and opened it up, and there's a sudden burst of innovation. About $10 billion of capital had come in from China to buy into our startups in a very big way. And I think that was very dangerous because, you know, we are never sure where the data from these startups were going, maybe going to China, because China is a leader in the digital era, possibly will overtake the United States maybe into 3 to 4 years in artificial intelligence and all of their issues. So I think business has become very cognizant. And today, if you look around the world, business is very careful and very, very worried about the rare earth situation. Where are they going to get the lithium? Because China has the world's largest quantum of rare earth. Silicon chips. The world is short of silicon chips. We used to say that data is the new oil. Now chips are the new oil because we are coming into the 5G IoT revolution and you require silicon chips. And the biggest silicon chip manufacturer, Taiwan, is off the Chinese coast. And there is a problem there in terms of security. And every country, including the United States, is more dependent on chips coming from Asia. And what about all the electronic devices? What about the iPhone? Everything is made in China. So I think the rare earth, silicon chips, data sovereignty has become an issue. Because today China has a firewall. The United States has the world's data sitting on it. The NSA of the United States can access all the data very easily by a subpoena because, you know, they have the law on the side. Cyber security has become a big issue because, like you said, Maha, you know, we saw in the COVID times some cyber security attacks against the vaccine manufacturers, right? And we know where it comes from. One particular part of the world is, you know, we can see it on the screen if you look very carefully. So I think it's extremely important. Business looks at it very dispassionately, diversified supply chain, looks at different kinds of different flows of capital from various different countries. And the old ways are gone. Yes, young startups, young people do not understand this. For them, what is important is grow, 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 business, market valuation, do everything else. I mean, that's perfectly right. But for the rest of us, we need to worry. And major businesses are extremely worried and they're coming out with their own strategies. So we require a new normal in the digital era. And I think the Indo-Pacific is the right way to have a partnership among all the countries to make sure that our vulnerability as a group comes down and we are together and we're adequately protected from over dependence on any one big country.
But Zunaid Ahmed, I want to bring you in over here. Does that give governments then a greater handle in trying to dictate terms to the industry? And that might not go well for the industry at large.
I would say government should play as a facilitator's role. We don't want to regulate very strictly, but at the same time, what the other panelists actually emphasize on the data protection, localization, sovereignty, and also the jurisdiction of the data usage, and definitely privacy is a very big issue. So government cannot actually allow any company or any other outsider to take their citizens' data. Today, businesses have assets in digital form, and they are deeply connected to the global technology networks. So we have to actually encourage our innovators, our startups to do new businesses, but at the same time, privacy and data protection regimes in the Indo-Pacific region range from countries that offer strong constitutional protection of privacy rights to those that do not provide explicit recognition. Almost every country in this region are facing the same problem because big giants like Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Oracle, they are taking all the data. Even Alibaba or this kind of e-commerce entities, they are taking our citizens' data to their data center. So I think this is the right time to discuss and take the decisions from the government side how we can actually protect our citizens' data, government data, sensitive data, and how we can protect our citizens' privacy. I think we should come to a decision like how European Union has introduced their GDPR. In Australia, we have seen how they have actually introduced their data localization law. I think we can actually learn from those examples, and we should actually take our individual governmental initiatives to protect our citizens' data and privacy, at the same time our national security.
Tobias, there was some amount of discussion on that in Australia. I mean, not exactly related to this, but the fact that news media outlets should get their fair due from some social media giants. That triggered a debate about data protection as well. How is that aspect being woven into the larger geopolitical as well as data protection laws that many countries are looking at?
Sure. Look, if I may, I just wouldn't mind just coming back a little bit to this question of, individuals and their concerns over, security and economics and also the private sector. I think, we've got to be very careful about kind of saying there's a block called the private sector that think one way, there's a block called government that think another way. What we have are big multinational companies that are often have as much leverage as certain states in terms of what's going on in the digital environment, if not more. And some of those choose to use that power well. Some of them use it not so well. I would say that in that security dilemma, something, and I don't want to dwell on it because we've had a long discussion about 5G, but the whole discussion in Australia around there's certain things we can do as guidelines from government, certain legislative measures we can put in place which help drive market decisions so that they do consider security. That is something government can do, and then the market can decide on the basis of that legislation what decisions it wants to make. And if you do that early enough, I think, in the innovation cycle, then industry has a good signpost for how it then innovates around that legislation so it can then be leading. So, in 5G right now, Australia is in a great position to be a real 5G hotbed of innovation cycles. And I know that's where, our industry is looking to position itself. So, there are things you can do where security decisions do have an economic benefit as well. So I think it's really interesting. And yes, of course, many individuals just want to use the online environment for their own benefit and are not too concerned about security. But there are also a lot of people who are very concerned, and that relates to, people's awareness of the value of their data privacy, and seeing these other pieces of legislation come in from the likes of the EU has certainly helped raise that awareness with members of the public. Could everyone be a little bit more savvy about how their data is utilized and the realities of what's going on in their data? Absolutely, of course, there's more that we can do. You mentioned the media code, and certainly that was a strong move from our government to say that, essentially having independent media sources that are paid for is a really valuable and important part of a working liberal democratic nation. Therefore, we need to ensure that media outlets are rewarded for the independent media sourcing that they provide. And you saw that blow up in the international media cycles, and other countries now studying our legislative measures to see if it's something that they might like to follow. But that also signposts that, we are at this tipping point, if you will. We've seen this incredible growth of multinational digital media companies, digital companies growing exponentially. And now it's almost the catch-up phase. And I think the really important bit we've got to think about here as governments and as any of us who are in the digital environment is thinking, well, what are the kind of values now that we want to position in terms of how we not govern, that's not the right word, but how we guide the digital environment in the right way so that it keeps on being a benefit rather than some of the alternative models that we're seeing emerge. And this is where, if you look at the geopolitics of tech now, the values discussion around tech innovation cycles, tech development, and how tech is absorbed into the global economy is absolutely vital. because there are certain trends that, if allowed to continue in this critical emerging technology environment, if they continue along a way which has more of an authoritarian bent on them, then it does lead to some societal outcomes that I think we have to be very wary of. And that's certainly something that we're in tune with in Australia. And we'll soon be producing an international cyber and critical tech engagement strategy, which will just give anyone an understanding of what it is Australia is trying to achieve in that environment and how it's going to go about doing that.
Erin, so we've spoken about governments, we've spoken about the industry, businesses, but technology is also about individuals, and that point has been made by a few of the panelists here. How do you create plural, open, transparent, and democratic technological partnerships for the region's growth and stability to ensure inclusive prosperity even for its people?
Well, I think that Tobias, to some extent, has actually answered that, because he talked about the, challenge of the enormity of these digital companies that you see in Australia, and this concentration of power around only really a few big technology companies. And I guess some people would be familiar with this example, and I think this might be what Tobias is alluding to, was when Facebook in particular shut down the news cycle in Australia. You could not access news through the platform. That's a rather authoritarian move in a way. And to think that one company has such power over citizens in terms of accessing news, and in Australia, I guess, I don't actually know these numbers, but if you looked at various groups in various regions, would 100% rely on that platform for access to the news cycle. So then what does that mean in emergency situations? What does that mean just in access to day-to-day news? It really does have a big impact, and it was a very undemocratic move by one technology company which had a huge impact here. Now, we were able to overcome that, but is that the right way for a media giant to be acting in Australia when we talk about a liberal democracy? Probably not. So I think that that's one of the challenges that we're going to have now. And I think that the everyday citizen did look at that and say, okay, how am I accessing my news? What's my relationship with this particular piece of technology? Then we saw the same thing with Twitter when former President Trump shut down his account and other people went onto other platforms. But I think our memory is very short, because we're all back on Facebook, we're all back on Twitter and relying on a handful of platforms, which is potentially, as we've seen in Australia, very dangerous for the average citizen in Australia.
As Paul Kapoor, bringing you in over here, because at the time when this legislation was being discussed in Australia, Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister, had spoken to several other countries in order to garner some sort of a global coalition or support. Now, what I'd like to understand from you is then, in the region itself, in the Indo-Pacific then, creating more partnerships then certainly becomes more important. In that context, for instance, if I only talk about America, in the Indo-Pacific, is it relying largely on what is called the Quad, or is there a possibility of expansion there as well? Because the United Kingdom, for instance, has indicated that it might want to collaborate with Quad on issues of technology and particularly 5G. Is that option open, and do we need to tweak partnerships to bring in more players in the region?
I don't think that in the U.S. view, the solution to these challenges and supply chains and so on are limited to the Quad or to anybody else. Of course, the Quad is one of the institutions through which these efforts can be channeled, and robust supply chains and secure technology networks are very much in the interest of member states. So if the Quad can provide, coordination between major actors in the region, that's great. And we've in fact seen that happening. We've seen the supply chain resilience initiative between India and Australia and Japan emerging from that. But the name of the game is diversification, I think. So smaller states will ideally have a role in that as well, providing alternate nodes of manufacture. Probably not so much for strategically sensitive sectors, but maybe for less sensitive, perhaps, sectors, maybe in a China plus one approach. And this is where groupings like ASEAN, I think, will come into the picture as well. And in fact, the Resilience Initiative specifically envisioned working with the ASEAN states to develop new regional supply networks. So the two are connected really, and I think the U.S. will want to come at the problem from both levels. Again, I think diversification is really essential. And for as far as extra regional actors like the UK go, I think from the US perspective, cooperation from those parties is always welcome as well, especially on tech security. As I said a minute ago, the United States doesn't want to see the Indo-Pacific's telecommunications networks compromised, nor does it want to see Europe's telecommunications networks compromised. If we can keep out nefarious technology and come up with alternatives, that would be welcome. And it's a UK, the UK's actually stepped up on the 5G front already. And that's probably had some downstream effects in Europe as well, perhaps with the French. So the more cooperation that we can get in these areas from small states, from extra-regional partners, I think the more is the better.
Zunaid, Ahmed, Palak, do you agree with what is being said by other panelists that other countries in the region are equally important? Is that how Bangladesh feels, that amidst all the big players that they would have a role to play over here in the Indo-Pacific, or do you think that it is still too early to say that?
I think it is the right time to consider this issue very seriously for each of our countries, because you know that this Indo-Pacific region is the home to some of the largest digital economies in the world, from USA to India, Australia, and emerging economies like Bangladesh and some other countries. And also the total size of the digital economies in this region stands to nearby $400 billion. So it's a huge potential we have. So I think we have to take all the necessary actions and steps to be self-reliant. I'm talking about the Indo-Pacific countries' interdependency is very important, because you know that we have the diversification, like if you talk about the innovation and the digital economy ecosystem between US, India, Bangladesh, Australia. So in different parts of our earth and different areas, we have the huge population size, we have the business opportunity. At the same time, we have the innovations and the infrastructures. But what we need to understand that what are the gaps we should actually fill up. So I think we should take all the necessary steps to produce the hardware, to set up the network and establish the infrastructures. At the same time, the nations can also take the skills and the technology exchange programs between all of our Indo-Pacific countries. I think by this way, we can be self-reliant. At the same time, we can secure our digital network and our country's security. Thank you.
How do you see the role of the smaller countries in the region now emerging in the Indo-Pacific? Can countries come together to strengthen supply chain security, protect critical technologies, and as well as sensitive data across global platforms?
Ma, the sad reality is there's a concentration of digital power in very few countries, very few companies. So small countries are at a disadvantage because they are neither creator of apps, they're not creators of apps, they're consumers of apps, and all the data is gone, they're held by somewhere else. What we need today in the world is a universal declaration of digital rights, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1949, which will be an international agreement which will protect the digital rights of every single individual on this planet. And that should talk about data sovereignty so that every country has sovereignty over the data of its citizens. It should tackle the challenge of global monopolies like Google and Facebook, which have all our data, and they're very powerful. Like Erin said, if they could shut you off. I mean, tomorrow you could be shut off. And if you're shut off, what happens to you? All your data, your creativity is there. You're gone. You're dead. You don't exist because we're all part of the network. They're the biggest threat to humanity now. And they've shown how bad they are by shutting off President Trump. Recently, the United States Justice Clarence Thomas, a very eminent justice, said there's a need for a law in the United States to declare the digital monopolies as public utilities. Just like the telephone network is, the electricity network is, they have to be declared as public utilities so the citizens' rights are protected because we are over-dependent on them. And this can be done to a universal declaration which will protect smaller countries. And the smaller countries also have to be part of networks. Now, another big danger that we have is that of platforms. Remember, in India, we are lucky. We have the India Stack, a financial tech platform which is not owned by any private company. Because they're owned by a private company, they'll have enormous power. We have the Health Stack. Under the Health Stack, all of medical data will be on a public utility which is governed by certain rules. We have guidelines for social media. We need all this collateral to be put into place. And for that, to protect countries globally, a universal declaration of digital rights, and each country has to have its own collateral. And in addition to that, in the Indo-Pacific, we all have to come together, agree on common platform and share these common platforms because, we don't want to be dependent on a Google and we don't want to be dependent on a Facebook. We don't want to be dependent on a Twitter, and they're getting more and more powerful because all of us are a piece of data. Data can be manipulated. We saw what happened with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook when they interfered in the elections. In the next few elections all around the world, people are going to interfere. The digital networks are going to interfere. We're going to have outsiders interfere. What happens to a democracy? Now, these are very serious issues, and they have to be debated globally. We need a global understanding. Maybe in the Indo-Pacific, we can all come together for a common agreement and agree to share data, agree on cyber security, agree how to protect yourself, agree how to have common resources, agree on supply chain, agree on 5G standards. In 5G, China has the majority of the patents. China has the best technology in 5G, right? And in Africa, it's all Chinese. The Chinese own Africa. And we don't know what is going to happen. So I think we are in great danger. And we have to have international agreements which will protect smaller countries. And the Indo-Pacific can be an example how we can all come together.
All right. I think Erin is raising her hand. She wants to make a point. And I'd like all our panelists at any stage, if anybody wants to make a comment, they can quickly raise their hands digitally. And then we can go ahead with the conversation. Erin.
Thanks, Maha. Sorry, I went for the digital hand raise instead of the physical hand raise. I just wanted to add to that. I think it's a really interesting point that you're making about this universal declaration of digital rights and so on. But there will be a bit of a correction in economic terms in the region over the next few decades. By the middle of the century, Indonesia and India are projected to be top 4 economies in the world. Pre-pandemic, these things are, in a state of flux at the moment. But that will change the dynamic. And then on the Australian side, with regards to the Quad, we've talked a lot about US-China, a lot about the Quad here, but central to that for Australia, and I'm not speaking on behalf of the government here, Tobias is, but this is really important, even in think tank world, in non-government world, is the fact that ASEAN centrality is so important, and our relationship as a country with ASEAN, what we invest in that relationship, we are a dialogue and a strategic partner of ASEAN. That's where a lot of our focus is. So where we see the strategies money falling in terms of how we engage with the region, a big part of that is ASEAN centrality, and we all know that is about smaller states. But that dynamic will change as Indonesia rises, as India rises. My former colleague, Professor Stephen Smith, who was our trade, defence and foreign minister for Australia previously, last year at Raisina, talked about, well, how do you accommodate the rise of Indonesia and the rise of India as their economies grow? So there is sort of this reason that we've got to be mindful of. It's not, if we're looking at, these digital rights, well, what does that mean when Indonesia grows and its investments in technology increase? Same with India. So there could be this kind of natural correction over the next few decades anyway.
As Paul Kapoor and Tobias, I'll bring both of you in, and I'll first go across to S. Paul Kapoor on the point that Mohandas Pai made, that technology, digital technology at the moment, and as Erin is pointing out, could change, that those dynamics could change over the next couple of decades. But currently, they are concentrated in some bigger countries, and US being one of them, Australia being another one. Under these circumstances, is the idea of dominance of these countries over the others, even in the Indo-Pacific region, a reality that we need to deal with currently?
I think there's an issue there, but I don't think it's national. I mean, I don't think that because some of these companies are located in the U.S. that it's sort of the U.S. doing it to other countries. These firms are doing it to the U.S. I mean, as was just pointed out, they shut down President Trump. So regardless of what one thinks or doesn't think about the president or former president, the fact that they had the ability to do that and to completely remove him from the conversation, with apparently no ramifications for them, is quite amazing, right? So I think that there are real issues with those companies acquiring too much power, and especially because they've been thought of in particular ways and given legal protections in the United States that allow them to do things that may or may not be appropriate, kind of given them protections that may or may not be appropriate given the sorts of activities that they engage in, right? And so those legal protections allow them to claim to allow opinions to be voiced on their networks and then not take responsibility for it, right? Because they claim that they're they're not actually writing it or publishing it, but they're just a kind of a neutral platform. And that gives them, so they're, we're in the United States, people are arguing about whether those protections should remain in place, about what some other ways there might be to maybe break them up, to curb their power in other ways. But I would say it's a mistake to think of these companies as sort of national assets or somehow acting on behalf of the country. They're located in the U.S., but they act quite independently.
But Tobias, for instance, in China, the Chinese government would use them as their assets, wouldn't it? So the situation is very different. So how do you strike a balance?
Well, what I would say is that there is no doubting right now that as governments, as a society, we're playing catch up to an internet which was designed a long time ago now, relatively long time ago, and began with hundreds of thousands of users attached to it. So there was a certain freedom culture that was associated with that freedom of everything. And now we're dealing with an internet which covers well over 50% of the world's population. So that's billions and billions of users. And what we're now trying to do is retrospectively, if you like, apply the law that equally applies online. But as nations and as individuals, we have different interpretations of how that law applies. So, we're guiding ourselves through how we apply that law so that people are safe and secure in an online environment, whilst not infringing upon their human rights, whilst not infringing upon their basic rights as an individual of communication and a whole host of other great things that the internet enables and rightfully should enables. And I would pose a massive caution. There are things that you do want government involved in the online space and legislating around, and there's certainly things that you don't want them. And if you propose that governments should have absolute authority over the online space, well, A, you would lose what it enables, which is, really the complete freedom of innovation and the kind of cultures for our economies, which we've enjoyed, the incredible growth in the online environment over the past 30 years. And equally, it plays to a narrative that is very prevalent in places like the UN, in various ASEAN meetings and various other multilateral forums around the increased state control of the internet, which leads to a very different kind of society than we're very privileged to live in right now. And that is a very current and live discussion. So I think we need to be very, very careful about proposing that states should, really by themselves, begin carving up exactly what that looks like. This is multi-dimensional, multi-actor environment where, fortunately or unfortunately, tech firms do own a lot of the capability and a lot of the backbone infrastructure. So we have to work in partnership, and that's challenging for governments. It does require that we do have to work out where do we exert influence and legislative power, and where do we just need to take a bit of a back seat to allow it to function in the way that it's enabled our modern societies to function. So, unfortunately, the answer is somewhere in the middle. We have these discussions regularly at state-to-state level in the various regional forums and global forums, but I certainly think with just a big degree of caution in thinking that governments would have every single answer and should begin creating big, signed legal agreements about exactly everything that should go on the online space. Quite frankly, you don't want government running the internet. It wouldn't be as great a place as it is now. And that's a government official telling you that.
Yes, I think many people would tend to agree with that, and especially the younger lot, those who are driving technology currently. Zunaid, Ahmed, what are the ways then in which we can enhance security and tech cooperation with public, private sector, as well as the civil society? Because often the accusation comes from the civil society that the governments, in the garb of national security, are trying to take away their freedom of expression through these digital platforms.
I think the nations must work together to bring the interoperability across the frameworks and make the bilateral cooperations more effective. And also, I think at the same time, all the member countries of Indo-Pacific area, we should exchange our knowledge, and we should also introduce this data protection, localization, and privacy laws for each and every countries to protect our data, to protect our citizens' privacy. But at the same time, the nations also can take upskill exchange programs to develop the high-skilled workforce in the region to bring inclusive digital transformation. And also we need to aware our citizens, because if we are introducing only laws or trying to regulate the companies, that is not actually feasible for all of our countries, all of our nations. We have to aware our citizens, and we have to give them technological knowledge so that they should aware about their individual data protection, and they should be literate in digital platforms. So I think if we can work together to aware our citizens and also introduce the proper laws and regulations, then we can make this digital space equal for all.
Mohandas Pai, even between countries, as there is going to be even more competition as far as technological advancements are concerned. As an industry person, purely, I'm asking you, do you believe that this kind of cooperation that we're talking about in the Indo-Pacific, is it a euphemistic idea?
No, I think the cooperation is required to create a framework all across where we are governed by the rule of law and not by the contract. See, today we have a very strange thing in the digital world. Everything is a contract. You contract with the digital companies and they say they protect your right, but it's a one-sided contract. Nobody reads a 500-page document that Google or somebody sends you. We just sign away all our rights, right? So we have to be protected. Now, if a startup from India goes to Australia, it needs the protection and the framework of laws. And today, frankly, our laws all around the world are behind the need of a digital state or a digital world. We are living in the digital world. It has come to us after COVID with a bang. It has happened already. Now, are there adequate laws to protect consumers, to foster competition, etc., to prevent the growth of monopolies? Look at Amazon. Amazon, with its huge $2 trillion market capitalization, huge amount of money, can destroy the entire retail industry and take it over, right? Because for them, the costing is marginal. So we're seeing this rise of digital giants at a scale we have not seen before in the world. Maybe the East India Company long back was a simile to what maybe Google is. You know, if you look at the scale and what they have, the sheer power, I mean, they're all worth about $8-9 trillion, more than the GDP of most countries in the world. So what do? So I think there's a requirement that all across that we need laws to protect citizens, individual rights. Courts can then adjudicate what has to be done. We can't do it with the state. We can't live in countries where we're protected by contract. Now, I'm speaking this as a business person. As far as innovation is concerned, we have to create a framework that innovation is fostered all around the world. There's a free flow of technology subject to proper security. There is an adequate protection of data. So we require a new framework. A global pact is required, and it protects all countries and all companies all across.
All right, so I think we now have the last 5 to 6 minutes. So I'm now going to go around in turns and give everybody 1 minute to make their closing comments. I'll start with Zunaid Ahmed.
In conclusion, I want to mention one of my favorite quotes, that is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So I think this is the time not to compete to each other, but more than collaboration and cooperation is needed. And our founding father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, said that his core of diplomacy was friendship to all, malice to none. But we want to create a friendship with all the nations, and we want to utilize the knowledge and technology for betterment of the world. So not for the single country, not for the single IT leader, but we want to create the equal opportunity for all of the Indo-Pacific nations and countries and citizens of our region. And this is the time to create more regional cooperation and platform for data sharing, for innovation, and introducing new digital solutions for the Indo-Pacific area. So I would like to request all of you to come forward and let's work together to make the world a better place.
Erin, your concluding comments, please.
I love that comment about going, if you want to go far, go together. And I think that what I'd like to conclude by saying is that's great from a government perspective, but we also need to pick up the civil society actors as well. And from my perspective, where I see the real return on investment will be is that younger generation of people around Australia, Southeast Asia, India, and others around the world, because if you're investing in them who are at the forefront of technology, they're the users of this technology, they're the creators of this technology, they're the real innovators and entrepreneurs in the region, investing in them in the long term is what going to carry these relationships forward, and it's also where you're going to find your solutions as well. So it's not just government going together, but also picking up that civil society and taking them on this journey as well.
S. Paul Kapoor?
I agree with everything I've heard from my colleagues. I'll just add that, for the United States, I think that the Indo-Pacific is about new partnerships. I mean, obviously there are old relationships, treaty allies, and so on. But as we look at the challenges that we face in the future, we're going to have to forge new partnerships to deal with new problems. That's part of what we've seen with the U.S. and India, and figuring out that relationship. Not a treaty ally, but a very close partner. And, we'll have to figure that out with other states, large and small, to tackle these problems that we've been talking about tonight, where we have to balance the need for freedom and openness with the need for a certain amount of management, right? And you can go too far on the management side, as we just noted, but you can also, but if you don't manage it, you can find yourself in a situation where you're vulnerable. And so striking that balance is going to be tricky, but I think with those new partnerships with states large and small, I have faith that we will be successful.
Mohandas Pai?
Well, we are living in the new world. It's the digital world today, post-industrial world. For that, we need international agreements on a global scale to make sure that certain fundamentals are put in place for everybody on this planet. Then we need global regional cooperation between countries. The Indo-Pacific is a great way to create a digital partnership between all countries. In fact, India, Japan already have a digital partnership. They signed an agreement. I hope India signs with Bangladesh, with Southeast Asia, Australia, etc. And then we need a national framework within each country to foster innovation, protect the rights of citizens, and make sure there's orderly competition. And I think all these three things are required. For that, we have to sit together, learn together, ideate together, and create common documentation. I hope ORF will lead the way in doing all this and in proposing a universal declaration of digital rights for the entire world.
That's right. Toby, final word to you today.
Wasn't that lucky last, as they say? Well, look, I think what I want to say as a conclusion is partnership is going to be absolutely central to everything we do. States with states, that's why Australia is signing partnerships with India, with other regional collaborators such as Japan, the US, and others. we're also working very strongly with the private sector. You know, they're equally part of the equation. Non-governmental organizations, you know, there's a whole multitude of civil society actors who are a key part of this as well. But I think the one big issue that we all need to be thinking of, whether we're in industry, whether we're especially in government, is that this issue is not going away in terms of its importance in statecraft. And if we as states are not thinking strategically about how we engage on cyber and tech issues over the 5 to 10 year time horizon, then we'll be simply left behind in terms of what's going on. So we need to do that together in partnership in our region. But I would implore all countries to be thinking about how they strategically engage on these issues, even if it's a plan in private or something that they share publicly. These are really important signaling tools and architecture for all of us to engage on these issues going forward. We will be in these kinds of panels for the rest of our lives because tech is only ever more central to the way that we engage as countries and human beings. Thank you.
So clearly the Indo-Pacific is an emerging region of importance for several reasons, tech of course being just one of the many other reasons. And as one of the panelists said, we need to go together to go far. On that note, I'd like to thank all of you for that very insightful conversation today. Many thanks.
Thank you.